Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We're so happy that you chose to spend some time with us, and we are very excited about today's program. We are still dealing with the issues of our times, unfortunately. They don't seem to be getting any better. We have another discussion, painful discussion about violence. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our founder, Dr. Randall Maxey.
Thank you, Dr. Neighbor-Stevens. Thank you, Dr. Walks and Dr. Hines, for joining me. The topic today is gun violence, and that's so important. We've already exceeded, even though we're only in the 5th month of the year, we've had over 200 incidences of mass shootings and countless numbers of shootings that don't follow the guidelines to become mass shootings. And if you look at this happening, it's all over the country. We're the richest country in the world, and some people would claim the most civilized, uncivilized country. But we have more gun violence than any other nation. We have more deaths than any other nation. And we have more children killed by gun violence than anybody else. So we have serious need for psychiatric intervention in what's going on. I'm very proud that our guest is Dr. Ron K. Bailey. He is the first department chair at the medical school at LSU, Louisiana University in New Orleans. He is an alpha brother of mine, Dr. Walks, and he is a full professor. He has been department chair at Charles Drew, at Meharry, at Wake Forest, and now he's at LSU. And he's an experienced psychiatrist. He's a past president of the National Medical Association, the previous chair of the board of the Cobb Foundation, and he is an excellent friend of mine, a good person. I'm going to let him take the honor of introducing his team. Doctor, if you would introduce Shakira, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Maxey, your entire group. I've been on Black Health Trust before. I really enjoyed it. I think you have outstanding service to the community and to us as professionals. So I commend you and your entire group for such, like all of you. But I'm partial to the psychiatrist, so that Ivan Walks is there. It warms my heart. But your whole group, I think, is just outstanding. Thanks for having us today. I brought one of our research team members, actually my research coordinator, Kira Barker. We've been working together now for 1 month shy of 2 years at LSU. I joined here, as you mentioned, in June of 21. I think we have 3 papers we published on gun violence. We'll talk about a couple of those today, and a recent one we just submitted on non-lethal injury. But I think that the 2 or 3 key issues that we hope to address today, and I'll give Dr. Barker the other mic, are that programs like yours, I think, are so effective at helping us educate and re-educate our community about issues regarding kind of what's happening in the gun violence concern, but also issues regarding safety for themselves and their family and their community. Next, I think we aim to get the point across. There are things that we can't do. Our community and individuals, professionals, and otherwise should not feel powerless and disengaged from the process. It matters. What we do matters, that we do research on it, and that we follow empirically based, research-oriented strategies to manage these concerns, I think, is also one of the key themes for us in today's discussion. And thirdly, I think that there are areas where we are putting a lot of focus on such. I think LSU in New Orleans is one, or we should be, because we are unfortunately a nidus for much of the adverse activity, the violence and the fatalities. But it's also a place, I think, for individuals to come and grow and learn. And I encourage all of you to maybe work collaboratively with us on grants and on support to find ways to work together in this regard. So those are my key initial thoughts for today. I would share that I'll give Dr. Barker the mic to get started. Her work with me has been outstanding. I inherited her as a research coordinator. We do a lot of work when I got to LSU on the issue of infant mental health. We have programs in schools throughout the local community. I did try to bring a bit more of what I call institutional focus to LSU. We have the Lodge County Hospital, about 600 beds, the UMC, or University Medical Center. We're going after Orleans Parish Prison, about 1,000 people there, mainly men, 93% African American. Give Dr. Maxey a lot of credit for encouraging me to do that when I got this job a couple of years ago. And we also pursue a homelessness grant, because a lot of patients with a SPMI or serious mental illness are homeless, with a growing such population in New Orleans, and many of them, unfortunately, are victims of violence. So those are my initial thoughts. Dr. Barker?
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm honored to be here. My work have been here, actually living in New Orleans now, probably 11 years, and all that time I've spent here with LSU. And over the course of the time I've been here, most of my work has been in child maltreatment and child trauma, but also in response to disasters, which are unfortunately something that we deal with often here in Louisiana, and behavioral health interventions kind of related to that. When Dr. Bailey got here, it was a great match for both of us, because he didn't know at the time that my background also, in addition to clinical psychology, was in criminology. Never got to use that degree, and now I'm finding in the research since having to use it quite a bit. So I think it's been a great match, and like you said, we've been doing a lot of work and trying to figure out some ways in addressing gun violence here in New Orleans. So I'm going to share my screen, and basically we wanted to talk just a little bit about some things that we have noticed, just some unique considerations with New Orleans itself. We kind of just talk a little bit about New Orleans for those of you who, I love New Orleans. I moved here, not knowing a lot about it. And when I got here, I stayed just because I love the culture so much. But there are a lot of things, when people talk about New Orleans, gun violence being a big part of that. And some things that make New Orleans very unique in terms of gun violence is the fact that not only do we have, just talking a little bit about some community issues that I think as a group will be great for us to discuss, but also some community trauma issues that have greatly impacted this area. So part of that being, we've been hit majorly, obviously, with natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina being one where, people talk a lot about it. Now, mind you, kind of going back a little bit, gun violence isn't something new to New Orleans. We've had this problem for many, many years. We've had this problem prior to Hurricane Katrina. But even with Hurricane Katrina, we saw a vast jump in that. In addition to that, we also were heavily impacted by the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We then also were a COVID hotspot. So there was a lot of things about New Orleans that's made it very challenging, and things that may have impacted the violence in our area. Dr. Bailey and I did publish a paper, and I wanted to show you a little bit of data just related to Hurricane Katrina. And so sorry, saw a chat there. Some things related to Hurricane Katrina. So gun violence, and we compared some data. This is looking at Baltimore and Detroit, and also the United States in general. And so oftentimes when people talk about gun violence, they talk about Baltimore and Detroit in addition to New Orleans. So this is looking at a graphic with some data, and you can see Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in August 29th of 2005. And from that, in the interim, we didn't have any data from 2005 because things were in chaos here, obviously. But you can see in the following 2006, 2007, we had huge spikes in our murder and manslaughter rates for this particular area. And then after we started to come down and resettle after the storm, we started seeing that the rates began to decrease. So there's, like I said, have we had issues? Absolutely. But definitely after Katrina, we saw major spikes. Looking a little bit at some other issues, we also had some, with that same publication, looking at some of the homicide incidents and non-fatal shootings. And we saw that given that New Orleans was a hotspot for COVID, we saw that we also had another spike right at 2020. And I've also included some updated numbers showing that, we were kind of, even though still higher compared to other areas, 2020, 2021, 2022, we still consider to see those numbers grow. And there's been a lot of things that we have been curious about, because probably from 2017 to 2022, we saw an 82% increase in both homicide incidents and non-fatal shootings in our area. So some of the questions have been, well, why are we seeing these issues? Why have we seen gun violence really explode in this area? Even though we've seen it within the countrywide, it's hit our area very, very hard. So I'm going to stop right there for a second, I guess, and open up for discussion and questions.
Well, I have a question. Is there a mental health reason that the United States has per capita more gun violence, I believe, than any other society on earth? I'm presuming that's true. Is it more to it than just the availability of guns? Is it something in our psyche, in our culture? What is it?
Dr. Bailey?
Did we unmute Dr. Bailey? I'm sure he has a lot to say about that.
Do you see Dr. Bailey, Simon?
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I was right.
There we go.
So absolutely, we've got a lot to say. That's what we're on for today. And I'm gonna give 5 very brief points. Dr. Walker can kind of comment on them. And I'd love to hear from your audience what our thoughts are. But this is really the signature, arm of our work. First and foremost, our country started, and there's just been a lot of history that's really not gone away with this idea that it's kind of us against the world, every man, i.e. person for themselves. And the way to do that is to have a gun, and that the gun is the barometer of power. I believe in my psyche that started a couple of years ago, and it hadn't fully gone away. As a psychiatrist, Dr. Maxey, I hear that regularly from individuals who can't make an official or an articulate argument in response to a question or a consideration that we should have less guns and we'd have less violence in our society. So that's number one. Number two, for me, is the idea that many people have tremendous fear of the unknown or others, I think very often unwarranted. Race plays a large role in this, other issues as well. As a psychiatrist, I've been flabbergasted throughout my career how often persons have been in my office for a session, in an Alcoholics Anonymous group therapy session, to kind of get off on a tangent, or in other kind of professional meetings where persons will make the argument that that they're at some degree of risk. We have the most industrialized country in the world, the richest country in the world, all of the parameters of exquisite wealth and privilege. And many individuals regularly have a huge weapon in their home because somebody's going to kind of come in and tend to take over. I remind you of the guy in Nashville a few years ago who a group was kind of parading down the street, and he walked outside with his gun because he claimed he had fear of them, and they're in a quiet, normative parade, which the First Amendment allows. Number two, this issue of fear, warranted fear. Number three, I do think that people increasingly have guns because they believe that I think that they're wrongful, but other than they believe that morally they're on the right side of the moral or ethical issues. And because of that, they can have a gun, and if they have to use it because they fear, again, feel fear, then they won't be consequence because of it. I think we'd have a lot less guns, less use of guns if
we can't hear you, Dr. Bailey.
Had some internet problems there, Dr. Bailey. Okay, are you back? Okay,
I'm back.
Dr. Bailey there you go.
And I'll be brief. So for the fourth point, I'll simply argue is I think that the other issue that's remarkably important, I'm a forensic doctor by training, is the legal issues just aren't fair. All too often, who DAs choose to charge with gun crimes, who they choose to follow up and punish, I think, more severely. We could discuss it for 2 hours now. It all comes into play. there's remarkable, it's called prosecutorial discretion. And I think that sends signals to certain individuals and certain communities that for them having a gun or being involved in a gun use of an activity will not create a negative consequence. Just look right now how surprised many really are that any punishment was given to these so-called Proud Boys after what happened January 6th of 2021. I'd love to talk to the audience about that. There's a lot more meat on that bone. And I'll simply end by arguing, I think the other issue is simply we have, I think, psychiatrically, like the Maxey's, I think, very shrewd and astute point, lost a component, I think, of the humanity in our society and our country that matters. And when you lose some of that, you're much more likely to harm others without feeling any consequence, or there's no emotional barrier to not just for defending yourself, but killing somebody to get back at a harm, or real or perceived. And I think that because of those concerns, many people feel justified in over-responding to provocations. And it's why you have road rage. Somebody jumps the car in front of you and you want to kill them, if you think about it. So I'll stop with those 5. Dr. Barker has some other comments she can make them, but I clearly think it's a important question. These are the things that we here in forensic psychiatry must address more effectively to make our society safer.
And thank you so much. But just the other tag-on question I'm gonna add that maybe we'll answer before the end of the program. Why is it that if certain individuals commit a murder, they go straight to jail? If others commit a murder, they go to a grand jury. And I bet you don't know which ones that they are. Go ahead. Any other questions, Dr. Neighbor, Dr. Walks, Dr. Hines?
I
Any
think
questions?
Dr. Neighbor is trying to get unmuted.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep you all safe from the dogs. The summary that you just gave, Dr. Bailey, is a nice construct, but I feel like there's still more to the story than what you have outlined. I have not studied it, so I'm just talking about what I feel and what I see. One of the things that I think I see is a loss of internal controls. And I don't know why those internal controls have been lost or when they've been lost, but I'm beginning to highly suspect, and I'd be curious to hear what Dr. Barker has to say about this. I think it is happening very early. And if it is happening very early, then we have a societal problem that we need to get under control immediately, because if we don't, we will be doomed, for future generations, because the root causes of this problem are not being handled.
I've kind of been thinking overall, because I also think developmentally and some infant mental health training as well. The idea of the loss of internal control, I think is for some people that it hasn't fully developed, or sometimes how we deal with conflict isn't modeled well. So if you see people deal with conflict in a way that tends to be more explosive. So this is without learning anything about guns or anything else. And then you put it in a context where you then see people deal with issues in kind of explosive outways. And then kind of also want to include in that communities very much with traumatic experiences, a lot of community trauma. And, from the standpoint clinically, when we don't talk a lot about how the things that we see, the experiences of loss, experiences of grief, makes us feel very much that we live in an unsafe world, that we feel out of control. And for some people, that feeling of having a gun brings some sense of protection. And so, I think it's an interesting kind of tie-in that we both have, a loss of internal control, or whether you've ever developed the internal control in a way that is healthy. Let me kind of express that, because you can have some internal control and it may not play out in a way that's healthy. But then you put on top of that living in a community where maybe that's all the things that you see and how you deal with life. And then you have a ton of conflict on top, trauma on top of that. We're and maybe Dr. Bailey will talk a little bit about this. We're working on through the city of New Orleans, hopefully being able to, I think we were awarded money to develop a trauma recovery clinic or center through the hospital. But some of the research that we started doing there was really just looking at people who had been victims of some type of crime, or not victims of crime, but they have experienced some type of injury, a physical injury, a gunshot, a car accident. And what we found was something like 60% of those people reported having seen someone who's sustained a significant injury, like a gunshot. That's a lot of people in this particular group who's also experienced a lot of physical trauma. So I think it's a combination of both, whether you didn't develop the internal control and then living in a dangerous, or your view of your community as being dangerous.
Dr. Waltz?
Dr. Hines, and then I'll go, Dr. Maxey.
Okay. Dr. Hines?
Well, in some ways, you kind of touched on kind of the question that I was going to ask about. Just, it seems like younger and younger people involved with gun violence, and to Dr. Nabors-Stevens' point, whether that is that immediacy, right? Like the things that need to just happen right now, but also maybe coupled with that humanity aspect. You know, I am curious if the humanity or the loss of humanity that Dr. Bailey was kind of mentioning earlier, if you think any of that ties into the way people socialize now in a much more disconnected, in truly like interpersonally disconnected way, and if you feel like that kind of contributes to the ways that people don't necessarily see the humanity of others.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it's a timely point. Issues are kind of multi-tiered. I think the lack of humanity place does occur because I think many individuals, especially younger persons, don't begin to develop deep social relationships early on. Or we all tended to, some years ago, make tongue-in-cheek jokes about how two kids could be in the back of the car conversing with each other, but they're texting and not really talking. We all thought it was kind of funny. But the reality is we've raised a generation, Black and white, Asian and Hispanic, of individuals who just are not as good at comfortable speaking with one another. And when you lose that capacity, you develop what also happens with understanding much of the nonverbal. So I think that part of the reason there's such fear, I think people are misreading cues or social cues, or I mentioned earlier, over-responding to perceptions, real or perceived, that they may view as being more dramatic and more extreme than they really are. I also think that we really struggle, this is clearly a psychiatric issue, with really lacking conflict resolution skills. I'm often surprised about how when someone comes to me with a conflict, and I don't work in a school, I work with grown adults. Often it seems to have been an initial difficulty, and then it goes right from 1 to 2 levels to 7 or 8. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle that used to happen before it came to the level of, the boss or the manager, the chair, that just doesn't happen. Lack of conversation, lack of seeking out a secondary opinion, lack of really putting yourself in another person's position to think about how they heard that or what they experienced. We quickly go to assuming the worst, and then it's at a high level. Now, in my business, going to the chairman's office for a discussion, I think very often in the parlance, in the real world, some folks quickly go to a gun. All issues that I think are cumulative and create a summary that overall I think is making our society more at risk.
So let me go, first of all, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Barker, thank you so much for the richness of this conversation. I want to go all the way back to Dr. Maxey's question, because Dr. Maxey put a couple of different things into his question. Dr. Maxey put a question about mental health, and then he put a question about culture in the middle. And I think sometimes it is so easy for us to say when someone does something horrific, horrendous, like just shoot strangers in a mall, that they say, well, it's a mental health issue. And so we are quick to dismiss the problem that this person just shot at random people children and adults in a mall, and we say, oh, that's an outlier because they must have a mental health issue. And I think that it allows us as a society to ignore the gun issue. It allows us to ignore this culture and all of the components of it that Dr. Bailey and Dr. Barker have been talking about, because we just dismiss that one individual as having a mental health issue. I think that we do have a lot of big cultural issues that allow us to get there. And as Dr. Barker and Dr. Bailey mentioned earlier, anyone that has spent any time in our criminal justice system, it's just a bad place. I've been the psychiatrist in a children's juvenile justice facility as well as in an adult facility, and these are not places you want to send people to get better, whatever is wrong with them. And so we really have to look carefully at what, as a society, we are doing for the youngest and the not so young. And here's my favorite. My favorite thing to hate is every time somebody who looks like me is in some kind of trouble, they say these words. Well, he was well known to law enforcement. What does that mean? That means that you all have had several opportunities to interact with this person, and things have gotten worse and worse and worse. There isn't generally a history of this person well known to law enforcement being treated in a way that is useful so that they can be better and our society can be at less risk. So I think that this is a very complex, very, very much needed issue. And the last comment I'll make at this point is,
recording in progress.
Slides just made me sad. It makes me sad to know that in this country that's often described as having so much, we can have those kinds of increases, and we have to come to a forum like this to get people to go, wow, look at what's happening in our community. Look at what's happening in our city. It should be on the national nightly news. It should be on 60 Minutes. We should really care that these things are happening in our communities in different parts of the country.
Let me add a few, thank you, Dr. Walsh. Let me add a few things to that. Is there any less violence in a rape or than a gun violent murder? Is there any difference in severity of gun violence versus a rape versus stealing somebody's life saving of $2 or $3 million? Shouldn't all crime, whether we consider it violent versus nonviolent, if you rape a woman in Macy's or Bergdorf Goodman, isn't that a violent crime? And why is that a civil case as opposed to a criminal case? I think there's more to it than just gun violence, because our population maybe can't pull off a rape in Bergdorf Goodman and can't get in the door, and maybe we can't embezzle $4 million. But crime seems to be a part of our society. And I don't make a difference between whether it's violent with a gun or whether it's nonviolent, stealing $10 million from somebody's hard-earned life savings. I'd like one of the psychiatrists to comment on that.
Yeah, I think you hit on some timely points. I think in turn, fully harm of others should be viewed similarly and punished accordingly. Either we should be in a punishment or retribution-oriented society, which often we in writing state that we don't want to be, but I think we practically function that way. Or we should be in a rehabilitation society, which is one of the 4 key themes of penology. But the reality is we do it differently. There's a lot of rehabilitation for theoretically civil nonviolent crimes. You can steal $600 million from somebody like Milken, and there's some kind of a program to get you, people trying to figure out what's wrong with you and how can we rehabilitate you and make that better. But the moment you engage in something that's viewed as external violence, what we call dynamic violence or qualitative violence, like the use of a gun to go into a 7-Eleven, and rob them for $200 or what have you, then a remarkable amount, I think, of the power of the government kind of comes down on you. So that's my point earlier about what we call prosecutorial discretion. I wrote a piece on this about a decade ago, and little did I know then how powerful would be play part of the role. What we're seeing now, in so much of the distributed violence, particularly regarding these mass shootings. How do we get to mass shootings? We get to Dr. Max because the truth is, I think there's a life is like a kettle, and at some point it just gets too hot, and then it'll blow. And I think we're seeing that in our society. Clearly, I mean, persons are not only historically, you get angry and you can't take it anymore, so you hurt yourself, suicide. Or we wrote a paper years ago on the 8 phases of corporate workplace violence. People would go into the post office and kill their spouse who's having an affair on them and kill themselves. Now people go into a school or into a mall or into a movie theater or into a grocery store in Buffalo or into a church in South Carolina and kill a bunch of other people, whether they choose to kill themselves in a murder-suicide or not. That's qualitative. That's not incidental. People are appreciating what's happening externally in society. There's a lot more media now. I didn't mention that piece earlier. They're feeling powerless to manage it. You're going to see some of this more with immigration going forward. Society very often views immigrants as less than humane, less than deserving of the humanistic components of life, the empathy and the safety and security that the rest of us want. And then some people who are on the loose edges, the psychiatric piece, those who may actually have less than rational thinking, may actually then choose to act out. And then the access to these weapons of mass destruction, a high magazine capacity weapons where you can shoot 500 bullets in a matter of, seconds, it's just a volatile combination. Clearly, I don't think you get the worst results that we're getting without all issues in play. The lack of the humanitarian perspective, the societal engine that we are that some people are less than others. It used to be race, now it may be immigration, other considerations, the mentally ill. And then I think the access to weapons that can hurt a lot of people in a short period of time. It's a very volatile cocktail. And I think, unfortunately, we're in the middle of it. We're going to need a comprehensive set of activities coordinated at federal and local levels to begin to manage it better. What we're doing now is just shooting small pellets at a huge tank, and we're not really making a dent in limiting these risks.
Is there a way to predict who's going to be violent? We had a speaker some months ago who looked at children, and he found that blood flow to the prefrontal cortex was deranged or less in these children. Is there any such thing in adults to predict who's going to be violent?
Dr. Barker, the first shot, that has some thoughts.
I think, Dr. Maxey, anytime we start to predict who is going to be violent, we have to really make sure that what we are measuring is being measured in a way that is fair. It's the only word that comes to mind. So many things that we do when we begin to put labels on people. One, labeling people without finding a way to intervene, as Dr. Bailey was just talking about, not giving people help unless they are very, very wealthy and they steal a whole bunch of money. These are societal decisions that we make. So when someone comes to me with this notion that we're going to be able to lock them up early or label them early, I have a lot of skepticism with things like that. So I'll let Dr. Bailey be the smart scientist. I'll be the guy that grew up in South Central LA and understand firsthand that things aren't usually administered fairly.
Are you saying that increased melanin content won't make you violent?
No, I'm saying being Black in America is dangerous. Is that clear enough?
That's very clear.
Well, the Barker, you got a comment? Or you want to jump on in?
Oh no, you jump
go
on
ahead,
in.
please.
Oh, Dr. Bailey, you jump on in.
Yeah. I think Ivan is right. The reality is, this is a road we've been down before, and all too often it's easy for people who want sound bites or easy to identify readily identifiable groups. That's why race very often is such a comorbid factor in these concerns. It's easy to identify somebody based on racial difference, much more difficult than somebody who has a religious difference or even a political difference, or the case may be, a geographical difference and the like. I think that the struggle with this type of concern, Dr. Max, is that these issues are multifactorial. I think I mentioned earlier, there are probably 4 or 5 key issues in play. In my experience, I've been doing this for 30 years, on how you might be able to consider what's leading to this scourge of violence. And one might start with that construct to try to think about how you can predict who's going to do it. But I think, as Neighbor Stevens said very correctly, that probably wasn't a comprehensive list. There are probably some additional factors in play. And what we find is whenever we finally get our hands on somebody who doesn't die, the guy in South Carolina, a good example, or the guy in Denver, and we question them. For those of us who spend a lot of time going and reading all of these depots and the like, it's always striking. There's always something there in addition to what others were not aware of. So I'd say that local society, and I think a media-based frenzy to quickly grab somebody and know what the answer is, or he was just mad at you because of blank. He went after you because you were an immigrant, because you were Black, or because you were a pregnant woman, or because you were this political party, or like, typically are not correct. And that's not the singular reason that person acted in such an aberrant and a violent and a fatalistic way. So what I'm aware of is how multi-determinant and multifactorial the issues are. I'm also aware that rarely these issues happen in a vacuum. Somebody knows, somebody close to you knows. So we need to be educating our entire populace. If you see something, do something. If you know something, tell somebody, and try to get individuals to some level of care, where perhaps there can be an interventional strategy to modify and decrease overall risk. In psychiatry, we quickly want to take people's guns and knives away. When you get out of the hospital, call the family. That should happen based on the data. And many people have not been to the hospital yet. We shouldn't wait until after you engage in a violent act toward yourself or others to then use these practices to limit risk. There are things that we can do. But I agree with Dr. Walks. I'd be very cautious about trying to identify who's going to be the one that's going to engage in it. Because I think that society views representative violence differently. They're more based on their fear. They're more afraid of you or me based on some of our demographics and the like than otherwise. And I think also that's a power of government that I would be afraid would be misused against very often poor and disenfranchised, and be frank, overly minoritized communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. Dr. Maxey, can we have a comment from someone who can't say, I've been a doctor for 30 years? Nasir Jackson, MS4, soon to be doctor, has raised his hand, and I certainly would love to get a young perspective.
Go right ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. Actually, hold on one second. Hey, my name is Nasir Jackson, and again, 4th year med student. Thank you, Dr. Walks, for the introduction. And also thank you, Dr. Walks, for that point that you made in regards to sort of easing on the labeling. I definitely agree with you in that sense, where we'd be wary of, saying like, oh, this person, looks like they're more violent because they're acting up in school, or, they're saying this in school or doing that in school, because chances are that may be a kid of color who may have some, needs that need to be met that aren't being met, in real time, especially in the school system. That actually leads me to a question I wanted to ask in regards to when we talk about violence historically, especially gun violence, especially in our communities, how much of that can be sort of directly or indirectly correlated to resources or lack thereof, in our communities, since we haven't had what we needed in the last couple, 100 years or so, going back to slavery times, and then going to sharecropping, and then going to redlining in areas in which we couldn't buy houses because of the color of our skin, to just things sort of piling up on itself to the point where we're, in a sense, historically in our communities say, hey, like, I need this, but I need it more than you. So it's either going to be me versus you. How do we address that as providers?
Wow. Thank you. Thank you for the question, soon to be Dr. Jackson. Appreciate you. And let me just say, appreciate you thinking comprehensively and proactively about these issues as you get into your career. Dr. Bailey, Dr. Barker.
Where did he go to medical school?
Oh, one of the best places on the planet. I have a nephew that graduated from Meharry Medical School a couple of years ago. You go ahead on.
Yep, the Meharry Medical College.
Meharry Medical College. Love it, love it. Dr. Bailey, Dr. Barker.
I'm going to give Dr. Barker first dibs, and then I'll make a comment.
Sure, absolutely, and I think you bring up an excellent point, and things that a lot of the data does support. From the research nerd perspective, we been looking at some other factors, and it's interesting because there's this finding about what we call income inequality. So within basically in areas where there is greater economic inequality, so meaning that I don't mean poverty. I mean, where you have people who make a significant amount of people who make high income, and additionally to people who are of low income or low economic abilities living in the same areas. And when we see areas that have greater economic inequality, we tend to see more gun violence. We tend to see more mass shootings. And it does bring to this point that there is some issue in terms of resources, and also looking at other people who seem to have, and how do I go about functioning in a particular area where I need the resources but it's not available to me. And we talk a lot about that. I mean, very specifically to New Orleans, where if you've ever been here, there's St. Charles Avenue, and one side of St. Charles Avenue, you're going to have the mansions, millions and $1 million homes. You keep going down St. Charles Avenue, and you're going to hit an area that is highly impoverished, high violent crimes. You can keep going down St. Charles, and you're going to get to the Central Business District and the high tourist areas, all on the same street. So it does bring up a good point to talk a little bit about those resources, and when people need them and they see other people have them, the methods that they go about in trying to obtain those.
Wow.
Dr. Bailey?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that the income inequality piece is an essential one. I also think that the relative issue regarding relative difference. I think we have an unfortunate imbalance in our society now, in our community, where people see themselves very much based on what place or status they're in. It can be based on religion. It can be based on geography. It can be based on your political persuasion. And what you do is less important than who you are, or whether you're part of a certain group or not. I'm often struck by the fact that when individuals ask you a question, one of the first things they want to know is, what kind of work do you do? I go play golf. Folks want to know, what kind of work do I do? If the police stops you, if you're speeding, regardless of the issue, whether you're driving correctly, breaking the rules, what kind of work do you do and where do you live? And I think that puts people in a context. And all too often, too many individuals, especially those who have the power of government behind them. I mentioned law enforcement already, whether somebody's making you a loan at the bank, or whether you get the hospital services because you go into the emergency room, or whether you go into a mall and you want services. I think it's kind of got us out of balance, Dr. Maxey. And I think all too often what then happens is persons recognize, if you're powerless, that you're going to get the short end of the stick in so many things. And I think that leads to a degree of acrimony and unhappiness. I think you have an element of our society that's very frustrated with the system. Some are willing to burn down the house, so to speak. We see a lot of lack of respect for institutions, government, and school. My mother's a school teacher. We don't want to teach anymore because kids fight the teachers now and punch the teacher out. There's a myriad of examples. But I think that these concerns, and I don't mean to sound like a pastor, I'm a psychiatrist, but the reality is they do tend to eat away at the core foundations of how I think a civilized society can exist. And you can't exist with tremendous anarchy and where there's a critical mass of too many people not following the rules. If everybody speeds, the cops can't stop somebody for speeding. They stop you for speeding if 90% of people are driving the right speed limit and there's one or two outliers and they can actually identify them separately. That's the analogy. We talk in psychiatry about getting people to kind of color within the lines, play within the boundaries. And we especially tell this to young adolescents, especially adolescent males, tend to be the ones all too often who are kind of all, as called Bill used to say, all gasoline and no brakes. Going too fast, trying too much, doing too much, and you're going to kind of bump up against the edges, so to speak. Society previously would put, bumpers around you, like at the bowling alley, to kind of keep you back in the middle. Now, too often, there's an attempt to kind of come down on you really hard, very quickly. And that's a volatile combination with persons who then again have access to weapons of high destruction, guns. It's a volatile cocktail. And I think we're seeing societies, not just anyone, not just New Orleans, although New Orleans is unfortunately at the top of the list for gun violence, fatalities. Too many societies across our country where this lack of loss of experiential concern about what should happen in a society. I mentioned the term lack of humanity earlier, overt fear, even when I think it's excessively considered, and then access, I think, to high volatile weapons, again, a volatile cocktail. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing the remnants of it, which is too much violence, too much distributed violence, and I think guns play a large role in that.
So the question I have is the following. To stop gun violence, I got an email today from a right-wing group suggesting that Armageddon is coming, everybody ought to go get a gun. This obviously, they don't know I'm Black, that's why they sent it to me. Should everybody applying for a gun license get a cerebral PET scan to look at blood flow? How would you cut down gun violence and presence of guns, or should we?
The answer on the cerebral PET scan is just no. Okay, go ahead.
In order to get a gun, in order to get a gun license, we shouldn't use that to rule people out.
I'll let my colleague jump in first.
This is very simply, you can't really have gun violence without guns. And the data has been very clear, and we are working on a paper now showing, in states where they have stricter gun laws, there's lower violent crime, there's lower murders, there's lower, suicides. It's, not to say it's that simple, but it's kind of that simple. If we do something about the availability of guns, then by nature, you have to see a decrease in gun violence. Now, does that mean the guns won't get to certain areas? Not necessarily. And Dr. Bailey could probably talk a little bit more about that pipeline, but it makes it more difficult, certainly.
Yeah, I jump in. It's a remarkably important talking point, and one that I think Dr. Maxey's audience should be mindful of, and Dr. Nabor-Stevens and Dr. Walks as well. During the Clinton administration, we passed our most substantive gun reform law during my lifetime. It went into effect in 1994 and lasted for 10 years before it sunsetted. Between 94 and 2004, we decreased mass shootings. We defined them as a shooting. It used to be 4 or more, now it's 3 or more, by 60%. As Dr. Barker points out, it's also true that we are very much aware that the constant narrative that gun laws don't work is just simply false, and it's not empirically based, and it's one of those oxymorons in our society where if you continue to repeat something that's incorrect over and over again repetitively, some people, some groups begin to believe you. That's why, again, I thank you guys for this opportunity. We need positive shows like yours where we discuss what's empirically based and what the research shows. The research shows if you have stricter gun laws, you absolutely have less gun deaths, you absolutely have less mass shootings, because most shootings are family-based, somebody that they're familial, but you still do have these mass shootings where there's 3 or more, and the concept is you actually not just going after one person because of one conflict, but there's some kind of a general theme. We need all of the above. We need more gun laws that make gun access more restrictive. We need fewer guns made and available to be bought. I think Dr. Barker also points out this so-called iron pipeline. Most of the guns are made in rural counties in rural southern states. Virginia, for example, makes the most guns, but then there's a pipeline across state lines to these large urban areas, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles. And that's where so much of the urban violence occurs, although some of those states, Illinois, New York, California, have some of the best laws. So some folks say the laws don't work. The laws do work, but it's the guns being transported across state line. That's the problem. The real issue is we're making guns that are too strong. We're teaching people like bump stock how to take a small gun, a single shooter or a 6-shooter, and make it into a multiple high magazine capacity weapon, like a machine gun. Those are the armaments of the conversation that have to be addressed at the highest level, at the federal level. And with federal legislation being blocked in this area, it's caused a huge problem. This started 25 years ago, and unfortunately, we're seeing an exponential growth, I think, of gun violence where everybody knows afraid. These are not things that you ever want to let out of the box. And we've done that. So it's going to take a minute, Dr. Maxey, for us to correct it.
I think in the point I'm trying to make, there was an incident in New York City some years ago where they labeled these 5 minority guys the Central Park 5 because they apparently were accused of raping somebody. Turned out that they were acquitted. A very prominent gentleman in New York who later became the 45th president of the United States wanted to lock them up and throw the key away. When that same individual was charged with the same type of rep, he was saying it's a witch hunt, but maybe there's some witches that we ought to be hunting. And I'm saying there's more to this. The rules only apply to people of color. They don't apply to the general society. My concern is, are we being diverted to consider only violent crimes violent or all crimes violent? And why do we have to just focus on guns versus the real cause of crimes and cheating other people? That's my point.
So Dr. Maxey, we are getting close to the end of our time. We do have a couple of hands up. Dr. Sherrod has a hand up, and soon to be Dr. Jackson has his hand up again. I'm wondering if we can take a couple of quick comments, limiting them to about 30 seconds each to make sure that we are as inclusive as we can be.
Great. That's Sherrod.
Well, happy Mother's Day to everybody. And I'm
Happy
sorry
Mother's
I missed
Day.
part of the lecture. This is a very complex, very frustrating problem for me. And you've hit a lot of points. And, I remember coming on a flight one time, sitting next to a Caucasian man talking about this. And I brought up he brought up the Second Amendment. And he said, you're talking to the wrong person, because is it the Second Amendment? Is that the right amendment? That we need the guns. And I'm just wondering, have you all talked about Michael Moore's documentary, where he actually talks about why we have guns in America? That was to protect the white people against slaves, right? That was the original reason for the guns in America. But just to make it short, what can we do to get rid of the automatic guns? I mean, if we could it's multifactorial, right? There are many things that need to be done. But to me, that's a simple one. Why do we need these guns of war in hands of citizens? Can we talk about what can we do to get those off the street first? I mean, you know what I mean? And then the other things, all of the other complex multifactorial factors, we can work on. But those automatic weapons, those are the ones that are allowing us to just get rid of a lot of people right now. 2 to 3 minutes and 8 people are gone.
Thanks, that's right. Let's get Dr. Jackson in.
So while we're getting Dr. Jackson unmuted, Dr. Sherrod, this goes back to what Dr. Bailey was just talking about. Our laws and the willingness to do something about changing the laws, that's at the heart of the issue. You can order a weapon of war made for the Israeli military. You can order it online and have it shipped to a gun store near you and go pick it up.
Wow.
Those are choices that are made at a different level. Go ahead, Dr. Jackson.
Hey, I just wanted to first thank Dr. Bailey for the invite. Really appreciate you. And also I appreciate Dr. Barker and in response to the question that I had earlier. I wanted to just touch on something which I heard a few minutes back about how it seems violent crime has, sort of decreased in age demographic where, the perpetrators of violent crime are younger and younger and younger. I wanted to ask, with the advent of social media and also to, with the COVID pandemic and sort of making youth less likely to interact with people living in, a sort of virtual age, whether that be because of pandemic or because of just, how technology is geared toward, in education especially. Are there ways to sort of quantify the lack of human interaction in relation to the increase in gun violence, especially amongst males?
Good question.
Do I know any answers to that specifically? No. I mean, in terms of looking at the data, it'd be something to be interested in. How do we consider, and trying to measure that? I mean, I think for young people, there's so many different factors that go into the whole gun violence issue. And obviously that we have a group that's come up during a very awkward time with the COVID pandemic, right? But I think, kind of also going back to the point that you made earlier, that this youngest group, which is the one that, are committing the highest amount of violent crimes, are probably the group that's also feeling the most in terms of the competition for resources, the lack of, feeling like I can move ahead, feeling that I'm most likely to be threatened. I need to have some weapon to help me feel protected. I think that 18 to 25-year-old demographic is probably the group that's experiencing all these stressors at an increased rate, without still having the full developmental capacity to make decisions that you might make as somebody who's 30. So, I think it makes it worse, the fact that there is the social media, lack of communication, lack of being able to, I'm going to say lack of problem solving, but problem solving in a different way that makes the outcome more beneficial.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're at the top of our hour.
I'm going to jump in, Dr. Maxey, and point out that Jackson isn't just accidental. At a conference at Meharry, outstanding young guy. We're trying to recruit him to come and train in psychiatry at LSU. And we need young guys like this, people who are, smart and intelligent, I think, on the X's and O's of psychiatry, smart guys like Ivan Walks, but also who are socially conscious. These are issues that affect our community. And I think it's going to be up for some of these issues for researchers like us, people like ourselves, to get involved in research of things that are likely to bring some potential solutions that then we can push policymakers to accept and promulgate, that I think are likely to be helpful in our community. Very often when there's data out there that policymakers can use against certain communities, that can be to their advantage financially and to win elections, or they jump on it very, very quickly. I think it's our argument to make the point that there's data arguing what we should do. I love Sherrod's comment. There are things we can do. It probably is more than a soundbite answer, but I think we need policymakers to hear these messages and to follow a lot of our recommendations. I'd also squeeze in, Dr. Barker pointed out, we just got a $1.3 million grant recurring over for 5 years on trauma recovery. So to make a long story short, we have this grant now where you're a victim of violence in New Orleans, whether it's a gunshot wound or a car wreck, and surgeons and anesthesia and nurses and the like run toward the injured party in the emergency room. Our team runs toward the family members in the waiting room. Imagine being a 9 or a 10 or 11-year-old person, boy or girl, and your relative just got shot or hurt or the like in a violent accident. It changes your culturation to violence. It softens, it affects your receptors, it affects how you emotionally respond. And then you go back to school the next day or week or what have you, and folks wonder why you're a lot more likely to react differently. So we think we're doing some things at LSU that I hope are likely to be beneficial for our community, but we could also extrapolate, I think, across national concerns. I'm very happy you came on, Dr. Jackson. These are the people.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to get final comment from Dr. Barker and Dr. Bailey, and then from our co-moderators. Dr. Barker?
Yes, I just want to thank you all for allowing me to come on here today and being able to discuss something that has, obviously very important implications, and being able to help our communities. And for me, a big part of it is talking about community trauma and, that how that kind of spreads across many different, parts of someone's life. So, yeah, I think this is, it's a jumping off point discussion, but a lot more work to be done.
Well, thank you. I hope you come back to visit us. Dr. Bailey?
And I'll be brief. As always, I thank you, Dr. Maxey, and your entire team for having us, giving LSU a platform that I think our psychiatry department needs to make these arguments. They've let me bring on one of my co-panelists or my co-workers, and I hope to bring more on in the future. I encourage all of you to be mindful, not just to LSU, but other settings where we are trying to really be involved in a deep dive from a research-based, empirically based perspective to find what the research show that may help us find some potential strategy solutions to address problems that affect our contemporary society I mean, this is really what the money is. This is really what action has to be and what we should be as professionals involved in this setting. I've often said, you don't have to be a Black psychiatrist to be in the National Medical Association. Max already mentioned that he's a past president, but you should be sensitive to the issues of this population and these individuals who I think historically have been traditionally marginalized and disenfranchised and really need, I think, the power of not only of government, but of intellectuals in academia.
I think we lost your voice. I started to say young Dr. Hines, but Dr. Hines, would you have final words?
I don't get to be young today. No, but thank you very much, Dr. Barker and Dr. Bailey, for coming on. I do hope that you'll come back. And in particular, I would love to hear more about community trauma and some of the ways that manifests itself. I think in particular, we speak so much about, and I'm thinking also about Mother's Day, right? Like, especially in the context of this discussion on gun violence and things of that nature, right? All of this trauma and all of this strength that as a culturally we espouse to, and the resilience that we espouse to, sometimes we don't necessarily recognize the manifestations of the traumas that we've experienced, let alone seek help for it. And I would love to hear us talk some more about some of the ways that can show up. I also really appreciate some of the things that were discussed outside of the policy level that we can do as individuals. And as a person with young kids, that space that says, make sure you understand, looking for understanding social cues, conflict resolution skills, engaging with people, with, humans, right? All has real value beyond just, that's not how you were raised. It has real implications in the long term. So thank you for talking about these things. Appreciate it.
Young Dr. Walks.
Thank you, Dr. Maxey. Dr. Barker, Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for helping us understand so many things. One of the things you've helped us understand is how difficult it is to have a conversation about gun violence without all of the other factors being critical to that conversation. This is a complicated issue, and it's an issue that we need to pay attention to, we need to study. Thank you so much for bringing this to us. I also want to point out that whenever I'm on the Black Health Trust, I hear from someone who, I couldn't get on Sunday, but I caught it on YouTube, or I caught it later. So the audience, and Dr. Bailey mentioned earlier how important it is to get the word out. Our audience is much, much bigger than how many ever people we see on the screen, because folks do go on YouTube, folks do go and catch the information later. So it's important that you all come and bring the information to a place that people know to go and look. And Dr. Jackson, I have a few good words for you. Take good advice from Dr. Bailey. That's all I got.
Very good. I thank everybody for joining us. Happy
I'm gonna give you your number.
No problem.
To everybody, and I hope the Lakers win that championship game that Dr. Walks wants to see today. And we'll be back next week. And is Reverend Peace still on?
Reverend Peace is still on.
Reverend Peace, would you give us a brief prayer as we close out?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It was a rich discussion today, and one that we certainly need to continue, because there are a lot of complex issues that we still need to dive into. So if you would, please pray with me. Most gracious and holy God, we thank you, God, for this platform today in which we can discuss one of the most horrible issues that are facing your people today. God, we ask that you will continue to help us, oh God, as we look to solve this issue of gun violence, this issue that is tearing families apart, tearing communities apart. God, we pray, Lord, that you would continue to lead and guide us as we seek resolutions of this problem. God, I thank you for Dr. Bailey and Dr. Barker for the work that they're doing at LSU, and for others like them, God, who are working throughout this nation who are putting together data and putting together presentations that will go before those, oh Lord, who will make decisions and will help us, oh God, to decrease the number of guns that are circulating in our communities. God, we spoke of mental health. We spoke of explosive responses. We spoke of, oh God, of internal controls. We spoke of this issue engaging people of younger and younger ages. God, we ask that as we dive into the data, that God, that we will also dive into our spiritual souls, that we can begin to see the loss of our inhumanity, the loss, oh God, that we as human beings seem to have found or seem to have picked up with regards to life. So God, be with us as we continue to resolve this issue and help those, oh God, who continue to fight, that we might, Lord, be a people of peace, a people of peaceful resolution, and a people of spiritual makeup that you have created us to be. So God, we thank you. Continue to bless this platform as we continue to discuss the problems within our communities. It is this, oh Lord, that we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And I would like to remind everybody, please send your email. We have a problem with our MailChimp. If you could resend your emails to social@blackhealthtrust.org. That would be very much, and as many of you send out your invitations to others, we need to build our list back up, and we'll be better next week. And we'll be posted on both Facebook and also YouTube. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Sunday. Happy Mother's Day, and thank you again, Simon, for your magic.
Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day. Great job.
Happy Mother's Day. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Right.